On the 21st of May 2026, the Department of Business and Trade announced something that many people thought would never happen: the completion of a GCC UK free trade agreement. The UK is the first G7 nation to successfully secure a free trade agreement with this six-member Gulf bloc, which comprises Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman and Bahrain. The government estimates that the deal represents a 3.7 billion annual boost to the UK economy in the long run, with tariff removal worth 580 million a year and a long-term increase in trade of up to 20%. The deal had been some time in the making, with negotiations starting under the Conservative government in 2022. Simon Penney CMG was His Majesty's UK Trade Commissioner to the Middle East from 2018 to 2023 and played a key role in the negotiations. He joins us today from Dubai. Simon, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte.
So what was your involvement with the agreement that we have finally seen come to fruition? And it must be quite a moment for you to see this actually materialise.
Well, do you know, actually, it really is. And as you mentioned, I genuinely, and I say this genuinely, had the privilege of being the UK's first Trade Commissioner to the Middle East in 2018. And I joined from a career in investment banking and had spent more than a decade at that point already working across the Gulf as a banker. And during that period, I worked with many companies that from the UK and around the world actually that are doing business here across the Gulf, helping them to scale businesses and raise finance. And what struck me most actually when I joined DIT in 2018 was that there was no plan in place at all to do a free trade agreement with the GCC or any of the individual GCC countries. And to me, given my background and experience, it just didn't stack up and it really didn't make sense to me. Although when you consider each of the Gulf countries individually, at that time in 2018, even the UAE was just made the top 20 of UK's global trading partners. So I can understand why the UAE wouldn't have been prioritised individually, because there seemed to be larger markets and bigger prizes. But the thing that struck me most when I added up all the Gulf countries' exports together, it made the GCC actually the UK's third largest trading partner globally outside of Europe, after only US and China. So in aggregate, the Gulf really mattered. And I went on, I guess you would say, a personal crusade across Whitehall to convince anybody who would listen to me. And I have to say I was helped considerably by Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at that time, who had a lot of deep personal relationships with the leadership of Gulf countries. And what he heard consistently from Gulf leaders was they want to do a free trade agreement with the UK. And Boris took this opportunity, I guess, and he tasked Liz Truss at the time, who was the Secretary of State in the department, for establishing a plan of how the UK could, what he described, turbo boost trade with the Gulf. And that actually is how the whole free trade agreement actually got off the starting blocks. And I have to say also that Liz Truss was a real champion at this point for the free trade agreement within the government and across the civil service. And her conviction was followed up by Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who became her successor, and then after her, Kemi Badenoch, who were all Secretaries of State during this period of time. So a little bit of a history lesson, but there was a lot of blood, sweat and tears that went into convincing our own government that the free trade agreement would have really significant economic as well as political advantages to the UK.
What were the main obstacles domestically? What were the main sort of, oh, we can't do this is that you came across when you pitched forward this idea?
Well, as I alluded to there, I think it was one of prioritisation. When Brexit happened back in 2016 and the Department for Business and Trade was established under Liam Fox, who was the first Secretary of State, the department, obviously went through a process itself of identifying what it felt would be the largest trade and investment opportunities for the UK to strike free trade agreements with. And one thing that's clear is free trade agreements do not happen overnight, and they require a significant amount of human resource to get them done. So, as I alluded to, the UAE alone was our 18th largest trading partner. There was no way that the department would ever have the human assets to do 18 global trade agreements at the same time. So it was one of prioritization. So I wouldn't say it was one of lack of conviction in the opportunity. The opportunity just wasn't seen at that time to be of the same scale as other free trade agreement opportunities that were presented back in 2016, 17, 18.
I mean, I guess an FTA, free trade agreement, one to one country to one country is difficult enough, as we've seen. But you're looking at a block of 6 countries, and often people just say, oh, the Gulf, as if it's one homogenous entity. But these are countries that are they're very different, and they have different priorities, different economies, certainly. That must have been quite difficult to navigate.
Well, it was. And, I have to say, we being the UK, were under a lot of pressure. And I mentioned, some of the messaging that came directly to Boris Johnson and Prime Minister, bilateral pressure from individual Gulf countries, a number of which were very, very keen to do what they described as bilateral free trade agreements, i.e., UK to UK, Bahrain to UK, Qatar to UK. But as I mentioned, individually, the countries weren't seen as big enough trading opportunities compared to others. So the decision was taken that we would aggregate all 6 Gulf countries. And as I mentioned earlier on, it made the Gulf the third largest trading partner to the UK outside of Europe globally. Now, the big underlying assumption, of course, in that is that, as you say, it's a trading bloc, and getting all 6 countries to agree a common position amongst themselves before they were in a position to negotiate with the UK, as you can imagine, that is a very, very significant undertaking. And all hats off actually to the Gulf, because I have to say, whilst I was the one who added them all together to prioritize the Gulf, I remained doubtful that the Gulf would necessarily be able to agree amongst itself on all scales a baseline position, but they have done. And you can imagine the diversity across the Gulf in terms of, take, for example, the UAE. It is, arguably probably the most advanced country in the Gulf in terms of, where it sits as a global trading hub. And then you've got, take, for example, Saudi Arabia, that's catching up very, very quickly, but it's not quite yet at the same scale as and the advantage of the UAE. So to get those two to agree on all of the chapters that sit across an FTA is very, very significant, because one thing the Gulf does, it works together in certain areas, and in other areas they compete head on. And in most areas of a free trade agreement, the Gulf countries compete head on amongst themselves. So again, full credit to the countries of the Gulf to be able to reach a common terms agreement before they could even negotiate a position with the UK.
We rattled through in the introduction some impressive statistics as to what this means for UK trade. But can you explain a bit more about why this matters so much? What will it actually achieve?
Look, I think, this is probably one of the most strategically important trade agreements the UK has signed in recent years. And I think the importance of it today in 2026 is arguably even more important than it was in 2021 when we got this thing off the block. And that's not just because of the headline numbers, but really what strikes me, and it struck many, was actually how complementary the economies of the Gulf and the UK actually are. I mean, for those of you that have worked in or familiar with the Gulf, it's one of the few regions in the world today that is investing at such an extraordinary scale and with a genuinely very long-term ambition. And across the GCC, you have massive programs of investment in infrastructure, in logistics, in aviation, tourism, energy, AI. I mean, you name it. Most of these sectors feature very, very heavily in the Gulf's individual economic plans. And the scale of capital, and by capital, I mean not only financial capital, but human capital deployment, is enormous. Gulf countries do think very long term. They think ambitiously, they think with speed, but also they execute with conviction. And this presents a very, very real opportunity, I believe, for the UK, as much today, if not more, than was the case in the past. I think it's fair to say that the UK and UK companies have benefited from history and the role the UK has played over the last sort of 50 plus years in the growth story that we see today. But one thing that is certain, and this was very, very evident when I was the Trade Commissioner, is there's absolutely no room for the UK to be complacent because global competition has increased exponentially. And that's why I think actually this free trade agreement gives UK companies a very real competitive advantage. And that's really because I mentioned the sectors, a number of the sectors that the Gulf countries are focused on. But this presents huge opportunities for UK companies involved in engineering, in legal services, finance, technology, education, architecture, consulting, project management, innovation, you name it. These are all skills that are in demand. So I genuinely see this FTA as being a great opportunity and should be seen through the lens of connecting British expertise across all of these sectors, which is still highly sought after, to match the ambition of the Gulf.
In practical terms, if I'm a UK business looking to export, what does it mean for me?
Growth, I guess, first and foremost. It opens up a market that was already very open, but I think what it has done is it will reduce a lot of the non-tariff barriers. I mean, a lot of people tend to think of free trade agreements through the lens of tariffs. And actually, when we did a lot of consultation, when I was Trade Commissioner with businesses through the various business groups and British companies operating here, tariffs were not often cited as the biggest barrier to trade. What we heard more often than not was actually the non-tariff barriers. So things like regulations, market access, reducing friction to trade, improving customs processes, leveling the regulatory environment. All these are areas which are not felt directly through tariffs, but it was felt that if we could reduce those frictions and align these regulations, then we would see it being a more level playing field and more familiar for UK companies that weren't operating here to operate into the Gulf. And as I say, given that it was done as a GCC agreement, the barriers now are reduced for 6 countries at the same time. So actually, as tough as it was to get to this position, it is very easy now for British companies to passport freely across the Gulf by many, many of these non-tariff barriers having been reduced. I mentioned tariffs. I mean, really, the highest tariffs in the UAE and across the Gulf were, no more than 5%. So the financial cost of doing trade was not the biggest barrier. It was more regulatory and standard alignment.
And so the last time you and I were speaking on a podcast, the Operation Epic Fury had just begun,
Yeah.
and we were shocked by Iranian strikes on the UAE and the rest of the Gulf, and we were discussing what it's like being there now. We can't look at this FTA outside the context of the regional conflict, which, despite recent hopes being raised about ceasefires, doesn't look like it's going to end, sadly, anytime soon. How does the regional conflict impact the FTA agreement, and does it make it all the more important?
Yes, I think definitely makes it all the more important. I mean, timing is everything. None of us would have known back in sort of 18, 19, 20, 21 when we kicked this off that in 5 years' time would be in the position we are today. But it takes 5 years to negotiate these agreements. So you could argue the timing was fortuitous in that sense, but it's not opportunistic. This isn't an agreement that was just decided at the last minute because of the conflict. This is something that the UK government and the Gulf governments got together back in 2021 and said, we're going to do this agreement because it's in the best long-term interests of UK companies, but also countries in the Gulf. I mean, these agreements are not just one way. So, we will see this opening up the UK market for Gulf companies. But by far and away, the biggest prize is for UK companies that will be operating in the Gulf. The current crisis, since we last spoke in the weeks after Epic Fury started, it's fair to say that things have quietened down significantly. We haven't seen any inward attacks into the UAE where I sit, for quite some weeks now. The devil will ultimately be in the detail of what happens with any future agreement. And it's fair to say at the moment that the market has adjusted. I don't think there was the cliff edge crash that people were talking about as one of the scenarios. I think the way that the Gulf countries and the UAE have adjusted and responded has been exemplary. And in some respects, I mentioned earlier on about how nimble and agile and sort of ambitious Gulf countries are. This will also additionally be seen as an opportunity to maybe pivot their economies, to double down in certain areas, to invest more heavily in the domestic economies over the weeks, months, and years ahead. And the more stimulus you see from the governments into their own domestic economies, the greater the opportunity there will be for UK companies to play a role in that. I don't see the crisis or the conflict is going to affect in the long term the region's position as a center of global capital, a center for logistics and aviation. The UAE, the Gulf countries are major global investors in technology, in AI and digital infrastructure. And I genuinely think all of these strands of activity will continue over time. But yes, there has been a disruption, and that disruption will typically be seen as an opportunity to refocus and recalibrate investment agendas in areas that may be beneficiaries over the longer term.
Finally, Simon, I'm going to ask you a broader question about the role that you had, which had a foot in diplomacy and obviously a foot in business. One of the, not accusations, but one of the comments I get about the way the UK does things is that we're not as good as others, I pick out the French, at linking up our business and our politics. I get told by my friends in the region, when the French come, they bring their businesses with them and it's all seamless. Is that something that we could do better? And how did you find that fascinating role spanning both business and diplomacy and politics?
I mean, I guess, yes. I mean, of course, we could always do it better. And I'm sure if you ask the French, they would say that they could do it better. I made the comment earlier on that we as the UK cannot be complacent because of our historical position here. We've done well, but actually but by growing our market share now is actually meaning that we're standing still. So, what we've seen is our share of the pie consistently the same, if not decreasing, even though the value of our trade is going up. So whilst trade grows, that's great, but our share is decreasing. So we have to continually look at ways, both as government and the private sector, as to how can we grow our market share. And, for anybody who works across the Gulf, you'll be very familiar that the government plays a far more significant role in the day-to-day running of the economies than we would have in the UK, for example. So, I think our relationship with governments is absolutely critical, way more than you might see in sort of our relationship with France or Germany, where the private to private sector is the more dominant axis. Here, there's a very, very strong government axis in business and trade. And I think one of my observations and takeaways from my time as Trade Commissioner was, I had 4 prime ministers during that time and 5 secretaries of state. That is incompatible with building relationships here with the leadership of the Gulf countries who, often will stay in ministerial positions for 10, 15, 20 years. Our constant turnover of prime ministers, secretaries of states and ministers is not good for business, because trade and confidence is built around trust, and trust is built around familiarity. And when our political leaders are constantly changing, it undermines the stability that the UK is seen as a reliable long-term partner. Now, that's not to say business can't operate in and around that, but for me, political stability and consistency is going to be absolutely vital. And whether that is an achievable scenario in our current political consensus, I don't know. But I do think the trade agreement, as a piece of government-led policy, is an excellent opportunity that the private sector should be grasping. It shouldn't be up to the role of the UK government to make businesses trade now. The hard work has been done. The private sector has to step up, and a big part of that is going to be education and awareness, and that's where departments like DBT have a critical role to play in making sure that companies are aware of the opportunities and aware of how to do business in the Gulf, because the playing field has been leveled. We have an advantage over many of our global peers now. The key will be making this free trade agreement work.
Would you have a message for businesses in the UK who may be looking at the headlines and thinking the Gulf is the last place I want to be? You're based there, you know it well. What would your message to those businesses be?
I can't think of a single visitor I've ever had in my 16, 17 years working here, and not a single minister who came out to the Gulf, and I accompanied them across the Gulf, who walked away from here saying, this is a place we should not be doing business. Everybody left with an incredibly positive view of the opportunity. In some ministers' cases, I won't say who, but I think, often you heard the comment that the perception of the Gulf and the reality of the Gulf can actually be, can be polar opposites at time. And I would imagine with the current crisis, those polar opposites may have grown further apart for some. But what I would say to anybody, if you have doubt, come, visit and engage, because you will see just how big an opportunity this is, just how open these economies are, and just how much positive sentiment there is towards the UK and UK businesses. So, we mustn't be complacent, but we really do have a window of opportunity now to take advantage not only of the free trade agreement, but maybe some of the instability that is going to create new opportunities alongside existing.
Simon Penney, former Trade Commissioner to the Middle East from Dubai, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Charlotte.